The Galactic Council had existed for 70,000 years before humanity discovered faster-than-light travel. In all that time, across thousands of member species and millions of conflicts, the Council had never once forbidden an entire species from participating in warfare. That changed exactly 3 years after Earth joined the galactic community. Ambassador Chen stood before the assembled delegates, her hands clasped behind her back, as she listened to the charges. The chamber was massive, a dome of crystalline material that refracted light from a dozen different suns. Around her, representatives from 400 species watched with eyes, sensors, and organs she couldn't begin to name. The human delegation, intoned Council Speaker Vrath, his 6 vocal cords creating harmonics that the translation device rendered as solemn authority, has repeatedly violated the terms of your provisional membership. You have interfered in no fewer than 12 regional conflicts. You have provided military aid without authorization. And most seriously, you have deployed human military personnel to active war zones on 5 separate occasions. Chen kept her face neutral. Everything Vrath said was technically true. It was also completely missing the point. Speaker Vrath, she said carefully, Earth acknowledges these actions. However, we believe the context of each situation justifies our response. In every case, we intervene to prevent genocide, mass civilian casualties, or the complete destruction of developing civilizations. A ripple of movement went through the chamber. The Tarathi delegate, a being that resembled a floating jellyfish filled with bioluminescent organs, pulsed an angry red. Context is irrelevant, its translator device announced. The Council exists precisely to manage such conflicts through diplomatic channels. Your species has shown a disturbing inability to comprehend this basic principle of civilized society. Civilized society, Chen repeated, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Is that what you call standing by while the Kresh Dominion used biological weapons on civilian population centers? We watched your diplomatic channels deliberate for 6 weeks while 4 million Pelthani died. The situation was under review, Vrath said coldly. A resolution was being prepared. A resolution that came 3 weeks too late for everyone on Pelthas 4. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of sounds. Delegates argued, their translation devices overlapping in a dozen languages. Chen had expected this. Humanity's actions over the past 3 years had made them few friends among the established powers of the galaxy. The Council prized order, procedure, and above all, patience. They thought in terms of decades and centuries. Humanity thought in terms of lives that could be saved right now. Vrath's voice cut through the noise, amplified to overwhelming volume. Order! The Council will have order! The chamber fell silent. Ambassador Chen, Vrath continued, your species' impulsiveness is precisely why you remain on provisional status. You do not understand the delicate balance required to maintain peace across the galaxy. Your actions, however well-intentioned, create ripples of instability that can take generations to smooth over. Chen wanted to argue, but she knew it would be pointless. She had attended enough of these sessions to understand how the Council worked. They would debate, discuss, and eventually issue a formal censure that Earth would be expected to accept with grace and promises to do better. Then everyone would go home, and nothing would actually change. Except this time, something did change. The Council has reached a decision, Vrath announced. Effective immediately, humanity is forbidden from participating in any military conflict anywhere in the galaxy. This includes direct military action, provision of weapons or strategic intelligence, and deployment of military advisors or observers. Any human vessels found in active war zones will be seized. Any human personnel found bearing arms in such zones will be detained indefinitely. Chen felt her stomach drop. Speaker Vrath, you can't be serious. This goes far beyond a simple censure. You're essentially stripping us of our sovereignty. On the contrary, Vrath said, Earth retains full sovereignty within your own system. However, the Council has determined that your species poses too great a risk to galactic stability. Until such time as humanity demonstrates the maturity required for full membership, you will be restricted from military operations beyond your borders. And who determines when we've demonstrated this maturity? Chen demanded. You? The same council that takes months to respond to active genocides? The same council that has maintained relative peace for 70 millennia, Vrath replied. Yes, Ambassador, us. The vote was swift and decisive. 347 delegates voted in favor of the restriction. 42 voted against. 11 abstained. Chen watched the tally appear on the displays around the chamber and felt a cold fury settling in her chest. They were being punished for caring too much, for acting too quickly, for valuing individual lives over political convenience. As the chamber began to empty, Chen remained standing at her podium. A few delegates approached her, offering quiet words of sympathy or support. The Pelthani ambassador, a small mammalian creature with soft gray fur, touched her hand gently. Thank you, the Pelthani said softly. My people have not forgotten what your soldiers did for us. Whatever the council decides, we remember. Chen managed a smile. That means a lot. After the Pelthani left, she was alone in the vast chamber, except for one other figure. General Sarah Kim approached from the observer's gallery, her military uniform looking almost aggressively practical amid all the alien finery. Well, Kim said, that could have gone better. Could have gone worse too, Chen replied. They could have expelled us entirely. Give them time, Kim said dryly. How long until this becomes official? The decree takes effect in 72 hours. After that, any human in a war zone is fair game for arrest. Kim nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. There are currently 63 active conflicts in Council space. We have observers or advisors in 21 of them. I know. We need to pull them out, all of them. Chen looked at her friend, seeing the same frustration she felt reflected in Kim's eyes. And the people they're helping? We'll have to find other help, Kim said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it any more than Chen did. The council has spoken. We're bound by their laws now. Are we? Chen asked quietly. Kim raised an eyebrow. Don't even think about it. The president was very clear. We follow the council's ruling. Earth can't afford to be isolated from the galactic community. Even if following that ruling means watching people die when we could save them? Even then, Kim's voice was firm, but Chen could hear the doubt underneath. We pick our battles, Ambassador. This isn't one we can win. They left the chamber together, walking through corridors filled with representatives from species humanity was only beginning to understand. Chen couldn't help but notice how many of them looked away as she passed, unwilling to meet her eyes. Whether it was from embarrassment, agreement with the council's decision, or simple indifference, she couldn't tell. The human embassy was located in the diplomatic quarter of the station, a sprawling complex built to accommodate the wildly varying needs of hundreds of species. The human section was modest, just a dozen rooms arranged around a central common area that someone had optimistically called the negotiation suite. Chen had been living there for 18 months, ever since she'd been appointed as Earth's permanent representative to the council. Her assistant, David Park, was waiting when she arrived. He took one look at her face and immediately poured her a drink from the bottle of whiskey they kept for especially bad days. That bad? He asked. Worse. Chen took the glass and downed half of it in one swallow. We're banned from all military operations, effective in 3 days. David let out a low whistle. The full ban? I thought they just hit us with another censure and some stern finger-wagging. Apparently we've wagged our last finger. Chen finished the drink and set the glass down harder than she'd intended. Start putting together the recall orders. Everyone out of active zones by the deadline. Everyone? Chen hesitated. There were situations where pulling out would be catastrophic. Lieutenant Jennifer Torres and her medical team were on Caldros 3, where a civil war had created millions of refugees. Captain Robert Jang was embedded with resistance fighters on Thraxis 7, helping them defend against an invasion by a neighboring system. Sergeant James Morrison was training local militia forces on Deneb 12, the only thing standing between the civilian population and slavers from the Grath Consortium. If they pulled out now, people would die. Lots of people. Everyone, Chen said finally, send the orders. David nodded and left to begin making the necessary arrangements. Chen stood alone in the common area, staring at the view screen that showed the station outside the embassy. Ships came and went in a constant stream, representatives of 1,000 different worlds going about their business. Somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the galaxy, people were dying in wars that the Council was too slow or too political to stop. And now humanity, the one species that had consistently shown a willingness to actually do something about it, was being told to stand down and let it happen. Chen walked to her private quarters and opened her personal terminal. She began composing a message to Earth, a full report on the Council's decision and its implications. As she wrote, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The Council thought they could restrain humanity with laws and threats, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. Humans didn't follow rules because they were convenient. They followed them because they believed in them. And when those rules conflicted with their fundamental values, with their bone-deep conviction that innocent people deserve protection, well, the Council was about to learn something that should have been obvious from the moment Earth joined the galactic community. You can't legislate away someone's conscience. You can only force them to make harder choices. Chen finished her report and sent it through the encrypted channel to Earth. Then she sat back in her chair and waited for the response she knew would come. The president would have orders. Command would have contingencies. And somewhere in the halls of power back home, people were already trying to figure out how to work around the Council's restrictions without technically violating them. Because that was what humans did. They found ways. They adapted. They pushed boundaries and challenged assumptions, and generally made nuisances of themselves in pursuit of what they believed was right. The Council wanted humanity to act more like them, to think in terms of political expediency and long-term stability. They wanted humans to be patient, to trust in diplomatic processes, to accept that sometimes people had to die while the proper procedures were followed. They were going to be disappointed. The response from Earth came 6 hours later. Chen read it 3 times, making sure she understood exactly what was being asked of her. Then she called Kim back to the embassy. "Change of plans," Chen said when the general arrived. "We're not pulling everyone out." Kim's expression didn't change, but Chen saw the flicker of interest in her eyes. "The president signed off on this?" The president signed off on a very carefully worded set of instructions that technically comply with the Council's restrictions, while leaving room for significant interpretation. Chen pulled up the orders on her terminal. "We're recalling all official military personnel from active war zones, as required. But there's nothing in the Council's decree about private citizens, or civilian contractors, or volunteers acting independently of Earth's government." Kim leaned forward, reading the orders more carefully. A slow smile spread across her face. "You're kidding. The president is offering immediate, honorable discharge to any service member currently in a combat zone who wishes to remain there as a private citizen. Earth won't provide official support, but there are several newly established private foundations ready to offer employment contracts for security consulting, medical assistance, and training services. The Council will see right through this," Kim said, but she was grinning now. "Probably," Chen agreed, "but they can't prove official government involvement, and technically we're following the letter of their law. They banned human military participation. They said nothing about individual humans making their own choices." Kim sat back, shaking her head in admiration. This is either brilliant or it's going to blow up in our faces spectacularly. Possibly both, Chen said. Send word to our people in the field. They have 48 hours to decide if they want to come home or resign their commissions and stay on as civilians. And when the council figures out what we're doing, Chen smiled, and there was no humor in it. Then we'll have a fascinating legal debate about the exact definition of government-sponsored military action. It should take them about 10 years to sort it out. You're a dangerous woman, Ambassador. I'm a woman who's tired of watching people die because of bureaucratic cowardice, Chen replied. Now get those messages sent. And Kim, make sure our people understand that if they choose to stay, they're on their own. Earth can't officially back them up. They'll understand, Kim said. They're soldiers. They knew the risks when they signed up. After Kim left, Chen returned to staring at the view screen. The council thought they could control humanity through laws and restrictions. They thought that because they'd spent 70,000 years building a system where everyone played by the same rules, humanity would have no choice but to comply. They were wrong. The thing the council didn't understand, the thing they couldn't comprehend because it was so foreign to their way of thinking, was that humans didn't define themselves by what was legal or convenient or politically expedient. They defined themselves by what they believed was right, and they had a long, proud history of finding creative ways around rules that conflicted with those beliefs. The Council wanted humanity to stop interfering in wars. Fine. Earth's government would comply, officially, but the Council couldn't stop individual humans from making their own choices. They couldn't prevent private citizens from volunteering their services. They couldn't legislate away the fundamental human impulse to help people in need. They could only watch what happened next and realize, too late, that they'd made a terrible mistake. Because now, instead of having humanity's actions constrained by military command structures and government oversight, they would be dealing with thousands of individual humans scattered across the galaxy, each one making their own decisions about who to help and how. The Council thought they were imposing order. Instead, they just unleashed chaos. And the consequences, as they would soon discover, would be far deadlier than anything they'd imagined. Lieutenant Jennifer Torres read the message 3 times before she truly believed it. She was sitting in a makeshift medical tent on Caldros 3, surrounded by refugees who had fled the fighting in the northern provinces. Outside, she could hear the distant rumble of artillery fire. Inside, a Caldrosian mother held her child, while Torres's medic, Corporal Lisa Chen, checked the girl's vital signs. The message was simple and clear. In 48 hours, all official human military personnel were required to withdraw from combat zones. However, any service member who wished to remain could request immediate discharge and continue their work as a private citizen. Several new private organizations were prepared to offer employment contracts to anyone who made that choice. Torres looked around the tent. There were 37 refugees currently under her care. Most of them were children. All of them were malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from various injuries sustained during their flight from the war. Without her medical team, most of them would die within the week. The Caldrosian medical infrastructure had collapsed 6 months ago when the Civil War reached the capital. The few remaining doctors and nurses were overwhelmed, working with equipment that was outdated by galactic standards and in desperately short supply. Torres and her team had been providing emergency care to refugees, training local medical personnel, and coordinating supply deliveries from off-world sources. If they left, all of that would stop. Ma'am? Chen appeared at her elbow, holding her own tablet. Did you get the message? I got it, Torres said. What are you thinking? Chen looked around the tent, her expression conflicted. I've got 2 years left on my enlistment. My mom's going to kill me if I don't come home. But these people need help. Chen gestured at the refugees. The Caldrosian government isn't going to provide it. The Council sure as hell isn't going to step in. If we leave, they die. It's that simple. Torres nodded slowly. She'd been thinking the same thing. This isn't a choice you should make lightly. If you stay, you're giving up your military career, your benefits, everything you've worked for. I became a medic to help people, Chen said quietly. What's the point of all that training and experience if I walk away when I'm actually needed? Torres felt a surge of pride in her subordinate. Talk to the rest of the team. Make sure everyone understands what they're choosing. We meet back here in 2 hours and make a final decision together. Chen nodded and left. Torres returned her attention to the refugees, watching as the Caldrosian mother gently stroked her daughter's hair. The girl was maybe 7 years old, with large eyes that had seen far too much violence for her age. She would survive, thanks to the treatment Torres's team had provided. But what about next week, next month? 2 hours later, the medical team gathered in Torres's tent. There were 6 of them total, specialists in trauma medicine, infectious diseases, and field surgery. Torres had served with most of them for 3 years. They'd been through hell together on half a dozen worlds. All right, Torres said. Everyone's seen the message. We need to make a choice. If you want to go home, no one's going to judge you. This is bigger than any of us signed up for. Corporal Chen spoke first. I'm staying. Me too, said Sergeant David Kim, their trauma surgeon. These people need doctors. That's more important than my career. One by one, the rest of the team indicated they would stay. Torres felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. You're sure? Once we send the discharge papers, there's no going back. We're sure, Chen said, and the others nodded. All right then, Torres said. Let's get to work. We've got a lot to do before the deadline hits. Across the galaxy, similar conversations were happening in 21 different war zones. On Thraxis 7, Captain Robert Zhang gathered his resistance fighters and explained that he would be staying, with or without official support. On Deneb 12, Sergeant James Morrison looked at the militia forces he'd been training and realized he couldn't abandon them now, not when they were finally starting to make a difference. Some humans chose to return home. They had families, obligations, or simply felt they'd done enough. No one blamed them. But the majority, nearly 70% of the humans currently deployed in combat zones, chose to stay. They resigned their commissions, signed contracts with hastily established private organizations, and continued doing exactly what they'd been doing before. The only difference was that now they wore civilian clothes instead of uniforms, and their equipment came from private suppliers instead of military logistics. The council noticed, of course. How could they not? But as Chen had predicted, they couldn't prove official government involvement. Earth had technically complied with the restriction. What individual humans chose to do with their own time was beyond the council's jurisdiction. Speaker Vrath called an emergency session to address the situation. Ambassador Chen attended, her expression carefully neutral as the speaker ranted about loopholes and technicalities. Your government is deliberately circumventing the spirit of our decree, Vrath declared. This is unacceptable. Speaker Vrath, Chen replied calmly, Earth has fully complied with your restrictions. We've withdrawn all official military personnel from combat zones. What you're objecting to is the free choice of private citizens to offer their services where they see fit. Surely the Council doesn't presume to control the personal decisions of individuals. When those individuals are clearly acting as proxies for their government, do you have proof of that? Chen interrupted. Because if you do, I'd be very interested to see it. Otherwise, you're making baseless accusations against people who are simply trying to help those in need. The chamber erupted in argument again. Some delegates supported Vrath, insisting that humanity was making a mockery of the Council's authority. Others pointed out that Chen was technically correct. The Council had banned government military action, not individual choice. In the end, they settled on another strongly worded censure and a demand that Earth discourage its citizens from participating in foreign conflicts. Chen accepted the censure with grace, made no promises about discouraging anyone, and returned to the embassy feeling quietly triumphant. But the real test was still to come. 3 months after the Council's decree, the Grath Consortium launched a massive invasion of the Deneb system. Their goal was simple: enslave the population and strip the planets of valuable resources. The Deneb defense forces were outmatched and outgunned. Without outside help, they would fall within weeks. The Council began emergency deliberations. As always, they moved with careful consideration, forming committees to study the situation and recommend appropriate diplomatic responses. It would take at least a month before they even voted on whether to intervene. The people of Deneb didn't have a month. Sergeant James Morrison, now technically a civilian security consultant, watched the Grath fleet enter orbit above Deneb 12. He had trained the local militia for 8 months, turning farmers and shopkeepers into something resembling a competent fighting force. They were brave and determined, but they weren't soldiers, not really. And now they were facing one of the most ruthless military powers in the galaxy. Morrison gathered his militia commanders in what passed for their headquarters, a reinforced bunker beneath the capital city. There were 12 of them, representing different regions of the planet. They looked to him for guidance, for hope, for a miracle he wasn't sure he could provide. "All right," he said, spreading a tactical map across the table. "The Grath have 6 warships in orbit, and they're landing ground forces at 3 sites. Intelligence suggests they're bringing about 20,000 troops total. We have 45,000 militia across the planet, but most of them are poorly equipped and have minimal training." "So we're fucked," one of the commanders said bluntly. "We're outmatched," Morrison corrected. "That's not the same thing. The Grath are used to overwhelming force working in their favor. They're not used to fighting an enemy that refuses to give up." He looked at each commander in turn. "I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to be brutal. A lot of people are going to die. But if we're smart, if we use our knowledge of the terrain and their ignorance against them, we can make this so costly that they decide Deneb isn't worth the effort." "You really think we can win?" another commander asked. Morrison chose his words carefully. "I think we can survive, and sometimes that's enough." Over the next 2 weeks, Morrison put into practice everything he'd learned in 20 years of military service. He organized the militia into small, mobile units that could strike Grath positions and fade away before reinforcements arrived. He taught them how to use improvised explosives, how to set ambushes, how to turn their own cities into death traps for the invaders. The Grath, expecting easy conquest, instead found themselves bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Every street was contested. Every building was a potential ambush. They took casualties daily, and their advance ground to a crawl. Meanwhile, on Caldros 3, Torres and her medical team found themselves dealing with a new crisis. A plague had broken out in the refugee camps, something the local doctors had never seen before. Without treatment, it would kill thousands. Torres worked 18-hour days, analyzing samples, developing treatments, and training local medical staff. The disease was unlike anything in Earth's databases, but she adapted, she experimented, and slowly she began to understand it. She developed a treatment protocol using local plants and medicines available on Caldros. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The death rate dropped from 30% to less than 5%. Thousands of lives were saved. Word spread. Other refugee camps heard about the human doctor who had stopped the plague. More people came seeking help, overwhelming Torres's small team. She trained more locals, expanded her operations, and kept working until she was too exhausted to stand. On Thraxis 7, Zhang and his resistance fighters launched a daring raid on a Grath supply depot. They destroyed enough equipment and supplies to set back the invasion by weeks. The Grath retaliated with brutal efficiency, bombing civilian areas in an attempt to break the resistance's will. Instead, it had the opposite effect. More people joined the resistance. Zhang found himself leading a force 10 times larger than when he'd started. They were winning, slowly and at terrible cost, but they were winning. The Council watched all of this with growing alarm. Human involvement in these conflicts was creating instability across multiple sectors. Wars that should have been quickly decided were dragging on. Invasions that should have succeeded were failing. The careful balance of power the Council had maintained was beginning to shift, and they had no idea how to stop it. Speaker Vrath called Chen to a private meeting, something unprecedented in Council diplomacy. They met in his personal chambers, a space designed for the comfort of his species, with high humidity and gravity slightly higher than Earth standard. "Ambassador," Vrath said without preamble, "your people are destabilizing the galaxy." "My people are helping those in need," Chen replied. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Vrath's multiple voices created a discordant harmony. "On Deneb, a war that should have ended in days has stretched into weeks. Thousands more will die because of your interference. Thousands more will live free because of our help," Chen countered. "The Grath were planning to enslave the entire population. How is that preferable?" "It is preferable because it is stable," Vrath said. "The Grath would have conquered Deneb, incorporated it into their territory, and the sector would have returned to peace. Now we have an ongoing conflict with no clear end in sight." Chen felt her temper rising, but kept her voice level. "So your preference is for quick, efficient oppression over messy, complicated freedom?" "My preference is for order over chaos," Vrath replied. "The Council exists to maintain balance, to prevent conflicts from spreading, to ensure that the galaxy remains stable even when individual worlds suffer. Your species does not understand this. You see suffering and you react emotionally, without considering the larger implications." "Maybe that's because we value individual lives over abstract political concepts," Chen said. "Every person who dies while the Council deliberates is a real person with hopes and dreams and people who love them. They're not just numbers in a report." "And that," Vrath said sadly, "is exactly why your species is dangerous. You cannot see the forest for the trees. You save one person, one world, and in doing so you create ripples that destabilize entire sectors." "Then maybe your sector needs destabilizing," Chen said flatly. The meeting ended badly. Chen returned to the embassy knowing that she'd probably just made things worse. But she couldn't bring herself to regret it. The Council's philosophy, their entire way of thinking, was fundamentally at odds with humanity's values. One side would have to give. She just hoped it wouldn't be humanity. Back on Deneb 12, Morrison received word that reinforcements were coming. Not from Earth, obviously, but from an unexpected source. 3 ships had entered the system, carrying volunteers from a dozen different species. They were civilians, technically, former soldiers and adventurers who had heard about the human leading the resistance and decided to help. Among them was a Pelthani warrior named Kelrath, a veteran of the conflict that Torres had helped end 3 years ago. He found Morrison in the bunker and saluted in the Pelthani style, a complex gesture involving all 4 arms. "I am here to repay a debt," Kelrath said through his translator. "Your people saved my world. Now I will help save yours." Morrison was moved nearly to tears. "You don't owe us anything." "That is where you are wrong," Kelrath replied. "When the Council abandoned us, when our people were dying and no one would help, your soldiers came. They did not ask what we could offer in return. They did not calculate political advantage. They simply helped because it was right. That is a debt that can never be fully repaid, but I will try." More volunteers arrived over the following days. They came from worlds humanity had helped, from species who remembered what it meant to be abandoned by the Council. They came because they saw in humanity something they thought had been lost in the galaxy: the simple willingness to fight for what was right, regardless of cost. The Grath found themselves facing not just a determined militia, but a coalition of species united by a common cause. The tide began to turn. The invasion stalled, then began to retreat. After 6 weeks of brutal fighting, the Grath withdrew entirely, their losses too heavy to justify continued occupation. Deneb was free. And across the galaxy, people took notice. The council convened in emergency session once again. This time, the mood was different. The delegates weren't just annoyed or frustrated. They were afraid. Speaker Vrath addressed the assembled representatives with barely contained anger. What happened on Deneb cannot be allowed to happen again. The humans have created a dangerous precedent. Other species are now following their example, interfering in conflicts without council authorization. If this continues, our entire system of governance will collapse. The Tarathi delegate pulsed a sickly yellow. Then what do you propose? We have already banned human military participation. They circumvented that restriction. Do we ban individual freedom next? Do we make it illegal for any species to help another without our explicit approval? If necessary, Vrath said grimly. The chamber erupted. Delegates who had been silent before now spoke up, arguing that such restrictions would be tyrannical, that the council had no right to control individual choice. Others supported Vrath, insisting that order had to be maintained at any cost. Ambassador Chen listened to the debate with growing satisfaction. The council was tearing itself apart, divided between those who valued freedom and those who valued control. And humanity, messy, chaotic, unpredictable humanity, was the catalyst. The vote, when it finally came, was close. 220 delegates voted to expand restrictions on unauthorized intervention in conflicts. 190 voted against. The measure passed, but barely. The new law was comprehensive and draconian. Any individual of any species found participating in a conflict without council authorization would be subject to arrest and imprisonment. Any world that harbored such individuals would face economic sanctions. The council was drawing a line in the sand. Chen read the new restrictions and smiled. They had just made the council's biggest mistake yet. Because now it wasn't just about humanity. Now every species that valued freedom over bureaucracy had a reason to resist. The council had overreached, and they were about to learn what happened when you tried to legislate away the fundamental desire to help others. The rebellion, when it came, started small. A few dozen volunteers here, a few ships there. But it grew. Species that had been silent before now spoke up. Worlds that had accepted council authority without question began to push back. And through it all, humans were there, not leading necessarily, but present, teaching, helping, inspiring. They showed other species that you didn't have to accept injustice just because it was legal. They demonstrated that individual choice mattered more than institutional authority. The council tried to crack down. They sent peacekeeping forces to arrest violators. They imposed sanctions on rebellious worlds. But every action they took only made things worse. Species that had been loyal for millennia began to question the council's authority. The carefully constructed system that had maintained order for 70,000 years began to fracture. All because one species couldn't stand by and watch people suffer. Lieutenant Torres, former lieutenant anyway, was back on Caldros 3 when she heard about the new restrictions. She was training her 100th class of local medical personnel, teaching them techniques that would save countless lives long after she was gone. "What will you do?" asked her student, a young Caldrosian woman named Velra. "Will you leave now?" Torres looked at the eager faces surrounding her, people who had dedicated themselves to healing because they'd seen what a difference it could make. "No," she said simply, "I won't leave." "But you'll be arrested." "Maybe," Torres agreed, "but that's not important. What's important is that you continue this work after I'm gone. The knowledge I've given you, the skills you've learned, those can't be taken away by any law or restriction." Velra smiled, and Torres saw in her eyes something she recognized from every human she'd ever served with: determination, courage, and an absolute refusal to give up. The council hadn't just failed to stop humanity. They'd created hundreds, thousands of new humans across the galaxy. Not biologically, but in spirit. People who would stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. That was the real danger humanity posed. Not their military prowess or their tactical skill. It was their ideas, their conviction that every individual life mattered, their stubborn insistence on helping even when it was inconvenient or dangerous or politically inadvisable. Ideas like that were contagious, and once they spread, they were impossible to contain. Captain Zhang, also formerly of that rank, heard about the new restrictions while planning a raid on a weapons facility. His resistance force had grown to over 10,000 fighters, a mix of locals and off-world volunteers. They were winning their war, slowly pushing back the occupiers. "They're going to arrest you if they catch you," said one of his commanders, a Thraxian named Court. "Then we'd better not get caught," Zhang replied with a grin. But privately, he wondered how long they could keep this up. The council had vast resources. They could deploy forces to every contested world, arrest every volunteer, impose sanctions that would cripple resistance movements. It was only a matter of time before the weight of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful institution crushed the rebellion. Unless something changed. Unless enough species stood up and said, "No, this is wrong, and we won't accept it anymore." Zhang didn't know if that would happen, but he did know one thing. He and the others like him had sparked something that couldn't easily be extinguished. They'd shown the galaxy that another way was possible, that you didn't have to accept suffering and injustice just because some ancient institution said it was necessary for stability. That alone was worth fighting for, even if it cost him everything. The tipping point came from an unexpected source. The Pelthani, a relatively minor species in council politics, formally withdrew their membership. They issued a statement explaining that they could not, in good conscience, remain part of an institution that prioritized order over justice, that banned individuals from helping others in need. Their withdrawal might have been ignored, just one small species among hundreds. But they weren't alone. Within days, 6 more species withdrew, then 12, then 30. The council found itself facing an existential crisis. Species were leaving, taking their resources and their ships and their political support with them. Those who remained were divided, arguing constantly about whether the new restrictions should be maintained or repealed. And everywhere, on worlds both inside and outside council space, humans continued their work. They provided medical care, military training, strategic advice. They helped because that was what they did, because they couldn't not help, any more than they could stop breathing. The consequences were indeed deadly, just not in the way the council had intended. Wars that should have been quick became protracted. Invasions that should have succeeded failed. Oppressive regimes found themselves facing resistance they couldn't crush. The careful balance of power shifted, and the galaxy became messier, more chaotic, more unpredictable. It also became freer. On worlds where humans had helped, people began to think differently about authority and justice and individual responsibility. They questioned whether stability was really worth the cost. They wondered if maybe the council's way wasn't the only way, or even the best way. And slowly, inexorably, the galaxy began to change. Ambassador Chen stood before the council one final time, called to answer for humanity's continued defiance of their restrictions. She expected censure, possibly expulsion, maybe even threats of military action against Earth itself. Instead, she found something different. The chamber was half empty. Dozens of species had withdrawn their delegations. Those who remained looked uncertain, divided, unsure of their authority. Speaker Vrath, looking older somehow, addressed her with none of his previous arrogance. "Ambassador Chen, you have heard the charges against your species. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Chen thought about Torres and Zhang and Morrison and the hundreds of other humans scattered across the galaxy. She thought about the people they'd helped, the lives they'd saved, the hope they'd inspired. "No defense is necessary," she said quietly. "We did what we believed was right. We helped people who needed help. We stood up to bullies and oppressors and injustice. If that violates your laws, then your laws are wrong." The chamber was silent. "Furthermore," Chen continued, feeling the weight of the moment, "Earth wishes to formally withdraw from the Galactic Council. We joined hoping to be part of a community dedicated to peace and mutual prosperity. What we found instead was an institution more interested in maintaining its own power than in actually helping people. We want no part of that." Vrast's voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "You would isolate your species from the galaxy?" "We would isolate ourselves from this council," Chen corrected. "The galaxy is much larger than the institutions that claim to govern it. We'll continue working with species who share our values, who believe that individual lives matter more than political convenience. We'll help anyone who asks for it, and we'll do it without requiring permission from anyone." She paused, then added, "You tried to forbid us from entering wars. You thought you could contain us with laws and restrictions. You were wrong. You can't legislate away conscience. You can't make rules against caring, and you can't stop people from helping others, no matter how hard you try." Chen turned and walked out of the chamber. Behind her, she could hear the eruption of voices, delegates arguing about what this meant, what they should do. She didn't look back. Earth's withdrawal was formalized 3 days later. Other species followed, some immediately, others after careful deliberation. Within 6 months, the Galactic Council had lost over a third of its members. Those who remained were sharply divided about whether to maintain the restrictions on intervention or to repeal them. The debate would rage for years, but by then, it wouldn't matter. The galaxy had changed. People had seen that another way was possible, that you didn't have to accept injustice in the name of stability. And once people saw that, they couldn't unsee it. Humanity didn't conquer the galaxy. They didn't impose their values by force or build an empire. They simply refused to stand by while people suffered. They helped, even when it was forbidden, even when it was dangerous, even when it cost them everything. And in doing so, they sparked a revolution that would reshape the galaxy for millennia to come. On Caldros 3, Torres continued training medical personnel, building a healthcare system that would outlast her. On Thraxis 7, Zhang helped establish a democratic government that would serve as a model for other worlds. On Deneb 12, Morrison watched the planet he'd helped save become a beacon of freedom and resistance to oppression. They were arrested, eventually, all of them. Council peacekeepers finally caught up with them, charging them with violations of the intervention restrictions. They were put on trial, facing decades of imprisonment. The trial was broadcast across the galaxy. Billions watched as Torres calmly explained how many lives she'd saved, as Zhang described the people who would have been enslaved without his help, as Morrison detailed the genocide he'd prevented. The council expected the trial to vindicate their position, to show that order had been restored and violators would be punished. Instead, it became humanity's greatest moment of advocacy. The accused didn't ask for mercy, they didn't apologize, they simply told the truth about what they'd done and why, and the galaxy listened. The verdict, when it came, was guilty on all counts. Torres, Zhang, and Morrison were sentenced to 20 years imprisonment each. The council thought that would be the end of it, that the example would discourage others from following in their footsteps. They were wrong again. The day after sentencing, riots broke out on 17 worlds. People demanded the prisoners' release. They protested the council's authority. They refused to accept that helping others was a crime. On Pelthus, the world Torres had helped save years ago, the entire population went on strike until she was freed. On Thraxis 7, Zhang's former resistance fighters launched raids on council facilities, demanding his release. On Deneb 12, millions of people gathered outside government buildings, chanting Morrison's name. The council tried to ignore it. They tried to wait out the protests, confident that eventually order would be restored. But the protests didn't stop. They grew. More species joined. More worlds rebelled. 6 months after the sentencing, Facing the possibility of galactic civil war, the Council released the prisoners. They were quiet about it, announcing it as a humanitarian gesture rather than an admission of defeat. But everyone knew the truth. The Council had lost. Torres returned to Caldros 3 and continued her work. Zhang went back to Thraxis 7 and helped rebuild what the war had destroyed. Morrison settled on Deneb 12, training a new generation of defenders. They were no longer alone. Thousands of volunteers, human and otherwise, had joined the cause. They formed loose networks of mutual aid, helping wherever they were needed without waiting for official authorization. They called themselves freelancers, and they became a force that even the Council couldn't ignore. The galaxy didn't become peaceful. Wars still happened. People still suffered. But now there was always someone willing to help, someone who cared more about doing right than following rules. Humanity's gift to the galaxy wasn't technology or military might. It was something simpler and more powerful. The example of ordinary people who refused to be bystanders, who saw suffering and chose to act, regardless of consequences. The Council eventually repealed the intervention restrictions. They had no choice. Too many species had withdrawn. Too many people had rebelled. The old order was broken, and something new was being built in its place. It was messier than what came before, more chaotic, harder to predict and control, but it was also more just, more free, and more alive. And it was all because humanity couldn't stand by and watch people die. Because they believed, with a conviction that wouldn't be shaken, that every life mattered, that individual choice was more important than institutional authority, that doing what was right mattered more than doing what was legal. The Council had forbidden humans from entering wars, thinking they could contain humanity's influence and maintain their carefully ordered galaxy. They learned, too late, that some things can't be forbidden, some impulses can't be legislated away, and some ideas, once sparked, burned too bright to ever be extinguished. The consequences were indeed deadly. Deadly to tyranny, deadly to oppression, deadly to the idea that suffering was acceptable as long as it maintained stability, and ultimately deadly to the Council's authority itself. Humanity had changed the galaxy, not by conquest but by example. They'd shown other species that another way was possible, that you didn't have to accept injustice just because some ancient institution said it was necessary. That was why galactic law had tried to forbid humans from entering wars. Because the Council understood, perhaps better than humanity itself, just how dangerous human ideals could be, how they could spread like wildfire through a galaxy that had forgotten what it meant to fight for something larger than self-interest. The ban had failed. The consequences were indeed deadly, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Chen, retired from her ambassadorship, sat in a small cafe on Earth and watched the news broadcast from across the galaxy. More freelancer operations, more species embracing the idea that individual action mattered, more people refusing to be bystanders. She thought about that first council meeting where Vrath had declared humanity too dangerous to be allowed military freedom. He'd been right, in a way. Humanity was dangerous, just not in the way he'd imagined. They were dangerous because they gave people hope, because they showed that one person could make a difference, because they refused to accept that suffering was inevitable or necessary. That kind of danger couldn't be contained by laws or restrictions. It could only be embraced or resisted. The Council had chosen resistance, and they'd paid the price. Chen smiled and ordered another coffee. Somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the galaxy, humans were helping people. They were standing up to bullies. They were refusing to be bystanders. And they always would be. Because that was what humans did. That was what made them dangerous and wonderful and absolutely, undeniably necessary. The galaxy had tried to forbid humanity from entering its wars. Instead, humanity had taught the galaxy how to fight for what really mattered. And that lesson, once learned, could never be unlearned. The consequences were deadly. and beautiful, and exactly what the galaxy needed, even if it hadn't known it. That was the story of how humanity changed the universe, not through conquest or technology or superior firepower, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to stand by while people suffered. It was the most human thing imaginable, and in the end, it was enough.